welcome to Kinwise Conversations in AI. Today I'm talking with Priten Soundar-Shah, educator, philosopher, entrepreneur, and author of the upcoming book, Ethical EdTech. What I appreciate right away about Priten is that he doesn't begin with AI tools or trends. He began with a deeper question. What is education actually for, and how do we make technology decisions that stay aligned with that purpose? In this conversation, we'll talk about why schools need more than AI policies, why teachers need space and language to think ethically, and why slowing down may actually help teachers make wiser decisions in a moment when everything feels urgent. Okay, Preeton, I am so excited to have you on the show and to learn about your story. You have a book coming out soon, Ethical Ed Tech. You have another book called AI and the Future of Education, and I'm so curious about your journey and how you ended up in this ethical ed tech space.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. I'm going to try to do this in a Spark Notes version. My journey is random, I would say. I started my first ed tech nonprofit in high school, and that's really what got me into the space. I was trying to explore at that point, like how we can use technology to scale tutoring. And I really have not left the space since. That's meant a lot of different projects, but the two most pivotal moments for my journey end up being my undergraduate education in philosophy. That really shaped my integration of thinking about what the larger purpose of education is, what kind of values ought to undergird it, and kind of help frame the civics angle that I think a lot of my work ends up having either explicitly or implicitly. The second pivotal moment ends up being the pandemic. So at that point, I had started, building out my company and been working with some schools and nonprofit institutions. But the pandemic was a moment where like the tech and education really came together. And so over the 2 years of the pandemic, we ended up working with over 200 institutions to help them transition to online learning or online extracurriculars. We did lots of debate tournaments and Model UN. And that really, built some connections with educators all over the world and gives me a chance to like do some real world problem solving on the fly. And so that was, it was a great moment for us to kind of work with the education community in a moment of crisis and collaboratively. And then those same people come back when AI comes out and now we're like, well, what do you have to navigate on this new crisis? And so it's kind of been the another moment where my tech background, which is largely self-learned, I kind of have been building tech platforms as needed. And that's kind of how I've been keeping up with the tech updates. And so that's how even some of my AI work has started. And so I kind of integrated all of that together to figure out how do we think about AI in education this time around.
How did you realize that values and ethics were going to be so crucial to ed tech in general and to AI when that came on the scene?
I think the ed tech in general piece is probably obviously what happens first. And I think that's where when I'm working on some of my projects and I'm at the same time learning philosophy and thinking about the larger purpose of education in a democratic society, it really changes the mindset with which I'm approaching what ed tech can do. And it's more, well, here are some goals that would be nice for us to achieve in order to further our democratic ambitions. And how can technology help us get there? So that's where the thinking initially starts is how do we use the tech to kind of realize our philosophical values? With the AI piece, I'll be honest, it was a jagged journey. I think when the technology first came out, I was very optimistic. I was very excited. I had played around with some large language models in college to like work on Sanskrit. So like there was folks who were trying to map Sanskrit into an AI algorithm to kind of do some decoding because it's a very regimented language. And then a few years later, now this comes out and a lot of things that I've been like thinking about, like this will be possible in 10 years to do with the technology suddenly became possible overnight. And that was very exciting as a developer and as a technologist. I think that was a moment where I was like, wow, like a lot of really cool things are possible. And then what we realized was that's not where educators were. And I think educators were really scared. They were really concerned. Obviously, assessments became a lot more challenging. And so a lot of my work shifted into like, how do we build some tech literacy so that teachers actually, can feel comfortable with the tech in order to navigate it. The pandemic was a time where I got to learn just how much of a tech gap there is in education. A lot of our work was getting teachers to mute and unmute and kick out a student. It was very basic tech literacy that we spent time building. 2 years later, there's AI. And so going from here's how you unmute and mute a Zoom call to here's how you think about AI was a huge gap in tech literacy for educators and still is. I don't think we've made as much progress as we needed to. I spent a few years building some tech literacy, helping teachers imagine what are the positive ways to think about it, what are students using it in ways that are detrimental to their learning, that teachers can adapt to it. I start to see that all of the most concerning things end up supercharging. And so I start seeing headlines of integrations that are a little bit short-sighted. I see a lot of techno optimism in the space suddenly. And so we go from being really scared and hesitant to feeling this, I think, a level of FOMO and moving at a speed that I think was faster. And then we're really prepared to navigate. So that's kind of where this book project comes at, is like, okay, like the first book talked about all the possibilities. And this one's like, how do we choose the right ones is kind of what I'm hoping it helps us navigate.
Because with AI, there's this explosion of possibility, like you mentioned, which leads to an explosion of tools, which leads to an explosion of choices. And so, how do you navigate all of the different opportunities that technology provides in a way that is aligned to your values and goals?
I
Yeah.
think that's the challenge.
Is that how do you do that when you're working
Yeah.
with a school or an organization or a group of teachers? How do you help people navigate that?
I think that one of the biggest challenges we're seeing, I mean, this is just like this is not a new problem. I think it's AI in a lot of ways is making a lot of our, pre-existing problems a lot more urgent because of the speed at which it's
Yeah.
moving. And so I think one of the things is we don't really have a culture of systematic ethical thinking in education. And this is something that scholars have written about. I mean, Levinson, who is a professor at Stanford, has spent a lot of her career thinking about how do we get folks to do systematic ethical thinking in education. But the larger argument is that a lot of other important industries have a really regimented, like, culture of ethics. And so the most obvious one is medicine, where, bioethics is an entire field that defines how practitioners ought to act ethically. But we don't really have an equivalent practice in education. And so I think a lot of it's like, how do we teach folks to think ethically generally? Like in the most abstract way, how do we build like the right vocabulary, the right heuristics? Then how do we kind of build that into education? And so how do we think about the purpose of education? How do we think about why why we're teaching, what values we are using to like shape our pedagogy and our curriculum, but also what values we want our students to carry with them. And then get to the like, what is ethical AI in education, right? Like there are two preliminary steps that we kind of need to deal with before we can answer that last question. I mean, I think when we rush to that last question, it ends up really still becoming about the tech and the tech literacy and what is possible. However, that should question is just not being censored the way it needs to, because we don't have the skills to do that as a community.
Okay, so you have your book, Ethical Ed Tech. So I'm guessing I would like to hear more about that, but you're kind of moving through this three-step process, or how do we have the ethical background? How do we apply that background to education? And then how do we make choices? Do you want to talk kind of about your book and how that shows up?
So the book, is to fill that gap in my mind, and so it is a good example of how I'm thinking about the problem as a whole as well. And so the book takes the approach of like, let's build some basic vocabulary about ethics, and I borrow from bioethics actually to provide some of that framework. And so bioethics has like one strand of bioethics. It talks about four different principles that medical practitioners can use. And so that's like make sure that everything you're doing is doing something good for your patient. Do no harm, so avoid any unnecessary harms. Make sure that you're respecting the autonomy of your patients, and then making sure that like all of the decisions you're making allocate the benefits and the risks equally among the whole community. And all of those work really well for education too. Like ought to be asking a lot of the same questions, but we just don't have that regimented practice of doing so. And then the final component that I argue is necessary for us to think about ethics in education is thinking about care. And so care is unique to education because the strength of our relationships actually changes how much of the goods that we want in education are possible. If you have a surgeon that you really hate and they're gonna, prefer, take out your appendix, you will still go home healthy, even though you really hate your surgeon, right? Like if they perform the surgery like to their best of their ability,
Mhm.
your relationship with the surgeon doesn't really affect your ability to go home healthy. But if you really hate your history teacher, it can have a huge impact on not only what you learned that year, but also how you think about history long term. And so the relationship does matter a lot more in education. Think about ethical decision making. We ought to think about what this is doing for our relationships as well. So once we kind of establish some of that vocabulary, think about, okay, like what are some heuristics for us to navigate those? What do we do when those conflict? Because that's all the interesting cases are when those will conflict and do conflict. Then what are the specific concerns that technology brings up? And so in particular, when you think about, with AI, the environmental concerns, a black box effect of not really knowing why AI is producing certain output, bias, data privacy, all the kinds of things I've been hearing about, those are really a second step, right? The first step is how do I think about ethics as a whole? Then what are the ethical risks of the technology? And once you kind of build that vocabulary, you kind of want to figure out like what are we going to do when those conflicts arise? And I have to kind of flag that I might be disappointing to the audience because I don't give answers. And that's because I don't think there are these universal answers. Like every single school in the country ought to think about ethical ed tech in this exact way. I think that answer is very, very different based on your individual context, what resources your school has, what your individual community is. Very similar to medicine. Like their ethics in medicine isn't about, every single case of organ donation ought to be dealt with this way, right? The goal is how does a practitioner on the ground, when they're facing an immediate decision, providing them the resources to kind of have those conversations in their community. Doing the same thing for education. Like, how do we make sure that we have a system where when there is a decision that needs to be made, we're doing it with ethics at the forefront and not as an afterthought. And then the book and I'll spare you, like, we can probably get into it as the conversation goes on. The second part talks about how we build that into policies and systems within our schools. And the last part is like putting it into practice. And so it's like, okay, now that you have the vocabulary, you have some of the systems, what would this look like in real life scenarios? And so I based on interviews I did and based on news scenarios, I build these like 12 case studies that are real decisions that actual educators have had to face about ethical education technology and kind of scaffold it out so that the reader can use the resources in the first two sections of the book to navigate that and figure out what they would do in that situation. So that's kind of how the book takes it. It does take a stance of like ethics is a form of takes practice and it's a skill set more than it is like this universal set of answers.
I'm curious about a couple of things. One, when you think about like the ideal reader for your book, who do you imagine?
The ideal reader would be the our average educator, I think. And so I think classroom teachers are really the audience. And I think that's counterintuitive for some folks. I think some folks, when they think about ethical decision making in education, often think about policymakers, they think about school building admin, they might think about their directors of technology in the school building. And those are all, I think, a secondary audience for the book. I think there is a lot that those audiences could also gain in terms of vocabulary and ideas for policymaking. But I think my ideal world is much more of the decision making happens at the individual classroom level, and that requires our teachers to have that literacy both with the ethics and the technology.
Why do you think that's important? And how did you make like,
Yeah.
why did you choose teachers over district leaders or people who might be forming AI policy in districts? Or, I guess teachers make a ton of decisions, but when we think about like decision makers, a lot of times people think about principals or district leaders.
Yeah. So there's a few different things here. I think the first is that there's a lot of micro decisions that end up having a huge impact on our students that are within the control of individual educators. And so they get the most face time with students. Like at the end of the day, even if a district buys a tool or they implement a policy, like the teachers are often the ones who are enforcing it. They're the ones who figure out whether or not this tool that the school bought will be used once a year or every day, right? Like those kinds of decisions that actually end up having the most impact are made by individual educators, right? So the reason we trust the doctor to make the decisions and not like the hospital CEO in all of these cases is because the doctor has both the subject matter expertise, but also like knows the patient the most, right? So similarly in education, our teachers are the ones who have spent the most time building up their skill set in terms of pedagogy and curricula and knowing their students, but they also know the exact moment in that scenario who is in their classroom that allows them to make the right decision based on all of those factors that we just can't abstract away at the higher levels. And the final piece of this is I'm hoping that educators can play like or listen to even more as we kind of figure out what the next stage of education looks like. I think oftentimes those decisions are made top down, and I think that that's because of efficiency reasons. It's because of tradition. But I think that if educators were consulted more on these things, there'd be a lot more buy-in on the policies, which I think is really important. I think we'd be making better decisions if we listen to the teachers, even if the final decision is stamped by an quote unquote admin person.
Right, because like philosophy is or policy is just compliance if you don't have buy-in, and the why behind that from people on the ground was just like how do you create a policy that's anchored in something deeper?
I think that anchoring is really important because you do end up with like, a lot of compliant behavior, which is just like, okay, like I'm going to check box like what was required of the policy and move on from it. And oftentimes what you also see is like, what is the bare minimum I need to do to adhere to the policy when there's not buy-in for the policy? And that's not really creating a culture of effective practice. It's not really creating a culture of ethics or active decision making by our educators. It is much more like, what is the bare minimum I need to do to like meet this requirement that I've been told exists? Which again, in terms of like efficacy and making sure that it actually shows up in lived practice is just not effective. And we see that with most decisions that happen in education that don't have buy-in from educators. They don't really end up doing what we want them to do. The benefits don't really accrue.
That's a good point. I mean, even teachers can tell their students to do things, but if students don't have buy-in to what their
Right.
teacher is directing them to do, the impact of the teacher's teaching doesn't actualize. So it happens in all spaces,
Right.
a directive without buy-in doesn't lead to real results. So if you're starting top down and you're thinking about a teacher who is using AI, I'd be curious, like for a story or an example where a teacher is able to kind of use an ethical lens to make a decision that is really positive around the use of AI. And then like the flip side where they're using AI in a way that has a negative impact.
Yeah. So the positive is so a lot of the use cases that I think well, so let me put a caveat here. So the first is that I in the book don't necessarily take a stance on what is a positive use case of AI and
Okay.
what is a negative one. And that's very purposeful. I obviously have lots of opinions on all of this. I mean, I could take a stance on all of it, but I think that while those stances I think are well reasoned and I have reasons to believe that, I don't think that there will be universal answers. And so that's partially why I resist the urge to do that. And I hope that I can equip individual educators to come up with that final answer if I provide them all the same resources in terms of the heuristics and the knowledge you need to kind of think about these things philosophically, because I might still be missing something that's relevant in a very individual context. And so
Absolutely.
the book doesn't do that, but I'm happy to take some stances on a podcast where it's not meant to be a prescriptive, answer for everybody. So I think one of the most interesting positive use cases I saw recently wasn't at the classroom level, it was at the school level. One of the crises that we've had for a long time in education, but has kind of gotten worse post-pandemic, is chronic absenteeism. A lot of schools are facing problems with students showing up to school and kind of getting them to be accountable for that. That's ends up being a lot of human time in terms of building that accountability.
Mhm.
One of the school districts recently has implemented a tool that when a student is marked absent, will auto text or email the parent and ask for like what is going on. And then the AI kind of like logs it into the system as like, okay, like this was actually a medical appointment. The parent never responded. The student was sick, putting all that into the system based on this like automated communication that's happening. And then that flags for the administrators, like who needs to be followed up with. So like which students have been like absent a lot with no parent responses, or, oh, this student's actually just like been sick a lot. That's a really cool instance of scaling something that really isn't like feasible in real life, right? Like we could not possibly be reaching out to every student's parent when they're absent at the scale at like
Mhm.
large scale, large institutions, especially. And it like makes the human part of this more effective because now it's like how do we triage and use our human resources in the most important and vital ways where the need is the greatest. And so I thought that was a really good example of like making the human connection with our students better and stronger and making use of that rather than kind of diminishing it. And I think that that's where the relationship ethical principle really does come in. And so if we quickly think about those like five principles that I started out with, like, okay, does the integration of this technology do something good? Yes, right? Like it's helping us combat absenteeism. So we're not just embracing the technology because it's new and flashy and cool. Like we actually can isolate any actual benefit that we gain from the technology. Are we adhering to like a do no harm? And so when you think about a tool like this, my biggest concern would be data privacy. So,
Mhm.
and that's one that again, like I don't know what the contract between the school and this tool was. And so that really is something that I'm hoping the school took into consideration and did the right vetting. But that's a question. If we can establish that like the data practices were ethical, the information wasn't being trained on, there weren't like, leaps being made based on biased information about why a student might be absent, but really was an information gathering system. I think with that do no harm principle, it could be adhered to. So I think there's a possibility that it's not like, obviously going to cause harm no matter how we implement it. The question of justice is a nice and an easy one here because I think you are like accruing the benefits for the folks that need it the most without accruing, harms to other folks. So like us reaching out to more folks or more families necessarily like causing an unfair advantage compared to what we are currently doing, right? So if anything, it's only helping us make the system more fair. And then the final piece is the autonomy piece. And that one's a harder one again because it's context dependent. And it's like, okay, did you get parental consent to reaching out to this? Are there considerations about when like a student might not want their parent to know? And how are we respecting that boundary? And what are our professional ethics in terms of those responsibilities? And so those again are individual concerns, but that's how you would think about autonomy in this case. Is like, are the parents explicitly consenting to their students' information being used in this way for them being reached out to? but also, the students consenting and what that means for us. And then the final piece is the care principle, which is this strengthening our relationships with our students or weakening them? And in this case, it's very clearly would only help us strengthen them because it allows us to reach out to our most vulnerable students and hopefully get them to show up to school. Okay, so that's the positive one. The negative one is a longer and easy list because you really only need one of those things to be really obviously bad in order for you to, at this point, probably be cautious about it. And I think I'll share the most obvious examples, and I'll do a bit more of a nuanced one. And so one of the things we're seeing is like a lot of school districts are moving to online testing, or especially standardized tests are moving to online
Hmm.
testing. Accessibility goes up because now like rural communities don't have to like, send students off to a proctored center where like the state is controlling the standardized testing. You might have like a lot of it's screen reader compatible. You can change the font to be dyslexic compatible, right? There are a lot of things that a online test or a digital test allow you to do that you really just can't do with pen and paper. And so that might seem on face value like a great use of technology in schools, like, that let's move more tests online. When you think about the long-term implications, that's where you start to think maybe once we move these tests online, what does that do for how we teach during the school year? And so one of my concerns with this is if the test at the end of the year is online, so much of our classroom behavior is test prep. Does that mean that we're spending a lot more time on the screen all year long because that's like test conditions during the school day? What does that do for our relationships with our students? What does that do for their social emotional development? Right, like that's where you're starting to think about, okay, here are all the possible harms. And is there a way for us to accrue some of those benefits? Can we only offer the digital test for students who need some of those accessibility things and not make it, everybody's going to use a digital exam? But that's where once you start thinking about how do these ethical concerns come up, you can also like come up with a middle ground. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, like everybody takes an online test or not. How do we solve that in order to still get some of the benefits of the technology? And I'm hoping that's the kind of nuanced thinking we could all do when we slow down and actually learn how to ask the right questions.
Yeah, it's really helpful to hear you go through like your thinking about how you make these decisions from an ethical lens because in theory, you might say, okay, this tool seems good or this tool seems bad, but it's more nuanced and deeper than that. You're thinking, okay, what's the impact in these different areas so that then you can make choices that feel aligned with your values and what you prioritize.
No,
Yeah.
that's right. I think most folks in education like want to think ethically, and most folks are trying. I think it's a matter of having the vocabulary and the processes because it's a skill set. Like if you're never taught it, you're never practiced it. Like it's something you might think is valuable, but not really know how to do it in a way that's systematic.
Yeah, it causes you have to slow down and think deeply. And those things can also be hard in an environment where there's a lot of pulls on your time and a lot of competing priorities happening simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest concern that I have is that in order to do this kind of thinking, we need to make more time for people to do the thinking. And I think that that's where I think the secondary audience of policymakers and district admin and school admin, I think I'm hoping they can see the value of individual teachers having that kind of time to help achieve their values better.
Yeah. When you think about right now, districts are rushing to publish AI policies and have some stance. How do you think these ideas around uh, on time or ethical infrastructure should show up in a policy ideally?
And I think this is where if we can like start integrating it in individual processes, it's probably like easier to do and rather than like a big scale overhaul. And so for example, I think with the district policies, there's schools and districts that we're seeing that are kind of again making top-down policies. There's a lot of like there's a lack of transparency. I think that there was a case in California recently where like the school admin or the district admin rather signed a contract with OpenAI and then redacted it for the board and
Mhm.
for parents and the community. I mean, it was a great example. I was like, okay, this is the perfect example of like non-ethical processes, right? Like, everybody's intention might have been great. I'm not, questioning like the what folks' values were in the system, but like there clearly wasn't a process for ensuring transparency of decision making, and that is an aspect of ethical decision making. So that's those are the kind of things we can start repairing quickly without overhauling things dramatically. The other big part of this is like how much we're consulting teachers and students when making these decisions. And so a lot of times even when we see like a student task force or like, an educator reading group that's part of this, it usually is like lip service. It's like, oh, like we have the student task force that are going to help inform our policy making. I think those are kinds of things we can implement immediately tomorrow to make our decision making a little bit more ethical without, adding a whole overhaul of like how everything in education is done or requiring a substantive amount of training for everybody. you can start incorporating more voices. And that alone is a good, easy baby step to start making better policies.
What role do you think students in particular should play in teachers making decisions about AI, schools, districts? What how do you think students should ideally be involved?
Students are complicated for philosophers for multiple reasons. And so there's the two biggest problems are first is that like developmentally, they're not necessarily thinking about their long-term implications. And so, if you talk to a kindergartner, like how much of their individual opinion on a policy ought to be considered, probably not a lot. It's not just like realistically, like there is a lack of, developmentally appropriate thinking that they can do about ethical decision making or decision making in general. But I think that we can phase it in a lot earlier than we often do. Oftentimes, it's never happens. Like even through high school, like there's sometimes a student representative at the school. Like there's all these like little things that we do to kind of pretend like we're listening to our students, but they really don't have any substantive power. But by the time they're in high school, they have a good sense of like what are these decisions that are being made? What are the possible implications? We can talk to them about it and we would have a conversation that's productive versus the kindergartner. I think figuring out how can we start incorporating student voices in a developmentally appropriate way is good. There are ways to even do that at a kindergarten level, right? So there's like you can scaffold decision making for different age groups. And so for a kindergartner, you might present two choices that you've already kind of vetted initially, right? So you're not saying, oh, like, do you want to have recess all day or like use this AI tutor? It might be, oh, do you want to use read the book on the iPad or do you want to read it on the physical book, right? There's little things that you can start doing that lets the student have a voice in their education. That doesn't necessarily, is like a student. As they get older, they should probably get more of a say, not only in their own individual decisions, but how like the school itself is making decisions because they do know best how the technology impacts them. They know best what like they want out of their education long term. But the second complicated piece, the developmentally appropriate one, is the first one. The second is we not only have an obligation to our students now, we also have an obligation to who they will be in the future, right? So the goal of education is not to like be something that is short-sighted. It's not like, okay, like you're providing food today and that's like, okay, like yes or no, are we doing the right ethical thing or distributing the food in an ethical way? It's also, are we preparing our students in the way we need to prepare them for 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now? And that often also requires just the insight of adults who have formed wisdom, have thought about this, can think about what values ought to undergird this. But so balancing how much autonomy we provide students with like how much we're also ensuring they have autonomy in the future it is a balancing question that we have. But I think the more we start to incorporate their voices, like right now we're so far from giving them a say that like I don't think we're going to end up in the like kindergarten or on the board example anytime soon. And so I think just in general, if the heuristic is let's incorporate student voices more, I think we'll be okay with safe.
That makes sense. It's because there's a lot of work to do, and so and I think most people are gonna start where it feels most natural, which is probably with your older students too. But it was helpful to hear your kindergarten example of like, here's a very simple choice that a 5-year-old could make that does have an impact on their learning. And as an adult, we all have preferences on whether we'd rather read on a screen or with a physical book. And so there's something relatable in that too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And students like being in charge of any, right? I
Choice.
mean, yeah, exactly. Everybody does. Yeah.
It's not just students, I think. I also like having some choices.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
exactly.
I have 2 more questions. One is, if you could offer a piece of advice for schools as they approach AI adoption, what would that piece of advice be?
The first piece of advice would be to slow down. And I know there are folks who are like we cannot afford to slow down. And that is the narrative that's kind of been predominantly pushed in by tech leaders often. And I think this is one where I think reclaiming some of our agency as educators is important. And we can only do that by slowing down. I think if we slow down and say, okay, like what are the problems we actually want to solve? And is there a tech tool that could potentially help solve that problem? That flipped reasoning would really help. And I'll give a quick example is like if universities are signing all these contracts with the major tech companies to integrate, like provide, ChatGPT accounts or Claude accounts to all of their students. And that's because those companies are showing up at their door and saying, hey, do you want to sign a contract that gives everybody a ChatGPT account? They might say, oh, well, like we've lost a lot of funding for PhD students and we need to make sure that we have enough TAs in the pipeline. And so maybe we actually will like reallocate some of our tech budget to hiring, to providing more PhD scholarships. that like there is a very different answer we might come up with if it's not on the terms set by the tech companies, but that requires us to slow down and make that space separate from the converse.
It's almost like people need to be able to take a step back before they ever enter into a sales call to say, "Okay, what is our priority in the first place?" Because there's lots of tools that can solve lots of problems, but knowing what the most important problems are to you, it is important. And just because a tool exists and solves a problem doesn't mean it's the most urgent problem for your institution at that moment. So it's really good things to think through. Okay, my last question is when you think about artificial intelligence right now, what is the thing that gives you the most hope and what is something that gives you the most concern?
So I think there are two sides of the same coin. I think that I'm hopeful that if we like build this community practice, if we talk to each other, if we really think about what our basic values are as educators and then approach how we shape education for the next era, I think we can make it a lot more human centered. I think we can solve some of the biggest problems we have. I think we might move away from standardized testing. I think we might move away from strict grading as the only incentive structure in education. I think we might be able to make our classrooms more human in general. My concern is we do the exact opposite, is that like we turn to more in-class standardized testing because we need to assess our students because, that's like what we have come to cherish as markers of funding and success. Worried that like we let the tech industry control the idea of what education needs to look like and, like start teaching prompt engineering in kindergarten when like no one's gonna be prompt engineering by the time these kindergarteners enter the workforce. Like it's just not, it's such a short-sighted approach that we're being sold on right now. And I just really hope we don't buy that approach and instead like use this moment to say, okay, like yes, like there's massive changes happening in society because of AI. But what is education's role going to be long term and not just like, what are we being told is the role like tomorrow for this like next 2 weeks until the next tech update comes out.
What stayed with me most from this conversation is Preeton's reminder that ethical decision making isn't about finding one universal answer. For schools, that means before adopting a tool, asking what problem you're actually trying to solve, whose voices are shaping the decision, and whether the technology strengthens trust, learning, and relationships is really important. To learn more about Preeton's work, check out his upcoming book, Ethical Ed Tech, in his Substack. And if you'd like more conversations and resources exploring human centered AI in education, visit kinwise.ai. Thanks for listening to Kinwise Conversations in AI. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay Kinwise.